I work as a night guard in a small, forgotten prison in the countryside, a place where time seems to have stopped. The building is old, with worn-out walls and narrow corridors that seem to swallow any trace of light. Most of the inmates are common thieves and petty criminals, but this doesn't make the environment any less unsettling, especially during the lonely early hours of the morning. Normally, the sound of crickets and the wind blowing through the cracks in the windows are the only companions for those working the night shift. However, that night, something was different. The silence was so thick, it felt like it was clinging to my skin, and that only intensified the weight of the strange atmosphere. As I made my usual rounds, I noticed something peculiar. The light in cell 13, which had been empty for months, was flickering in an unsettling way. My first reaction was to think it was an electrical issue, something the warden often complained about when we ignored it. I decided to check it out. As I approached the cell, an unexpected chill ran up my spine, as if the air around me had changed temperature. The door was locked, exactly as it should be. But the light flickered with a frequency that seemed almost deliberate, as if it wanted to get my attention. What truly unsettled me, however, was what I noticed when I looked closer. In the darkest corner of the cell, something seemed to be there. A shapeless shadow that made no sense in that empty space. It was as if the darkness itself had depth, a presence that shouldn't exist. Still, I tried to convince myself it could just be my mind playing tricks on me, so I asked aloud, "Is anyone there?" My words echoed through the corridors, but instead of relief, they only heightened the strangeness. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it inside the cell, but for some reason, the light seemed to be swallowed before it could reach the back. It was as if that shadow absorbed the brightness, creating an invisible barrier. My instinct told me to back off, but something inside me urged me to continue. Each step I took toward the cell seemed heavier, as if the air around me was getting denser and harder to breathe. My heart was pounding faster with every second, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew stronger. Suddenly, the light stopped flickering, plunging the area into an even more disturbing twilight. I stood still for a moment, trying to decide whether to move forward or retreat, when something, almost imperceptible, shifted inside the cell. In the corner where the darkness seemed alive, suddenly a deep, slow sound invaded the silence. A heavy breath that seemed to reverberate within the cell, as if the space were much larger than it actually was. My instinct screamed for me to run, but curiosity, or perhaps the need to know I wasn't going crazy, kept me frozen in place. With the flashlight trembling in my hand, I pointed the light toward the darkest corner. It was then that I saw something I could never explain. That figure was neither human nor animal. Tall and thin, its arms were long and disproportionate, ending in fingers sharp as claws. Its eyes, fixed on me, glowed in a strange way, not with life but with a terrifying absence, an emptiness that seemed to pull everything into itself. What was most disturbing was the feeling that it was studying me, every movement, every shiver, as if waiting for something only it knew. My throat felt locked as I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I swallowed hard, feeling my heart almost leap from my chest. The creature took a step forward, but it still remained partially hidden in the shadows, as if playing with the line between being seen and hiding. The air around me grew icy, almost suffocating, and each second seemed to drag on. Then I heard a voice, but it didn't come from outside. It was inside my mind, a presence that invaded my thoughts. "You saw me. Now you can't forget me." The words echoed in my head like a whisper and a scream at the same time, leaving a sense of overwhelming oppression. My body reacted before my mind, and I stumbled backward, knocking the flashlight over in the process. It rolled on the floor, partially illuminating the cell, but what happened next left me completely bewildered. When I looked again, the creature was no longer there. The dark corner was now just that, an empty corner, The cell seemed exactly as it should be, old and worn with nothing but dust and dirty walls. But the feeling that something had happened was still there, imprinted in every fiber of my being. I lifted the flashlight with trembling hands, searching the space around me, but it was as if it had never existed. Yet the sound of breathing was still there. It was weaker now, a whisper on the edge of hearing, but enough to make me know that somehow it wasn't over. The silence returned to envelop the prison, but for me that night turned into a nightmare I knew I would never forget. I ran back to the control room, my heart racing as I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was just a result of fatigue or the darkness playing tricks on my mind. I sat in the chair, breathing deeply, and trying to compose myself as I turned on the monitors to check the security cameras. I went straight to cell 13, but, as if mocking me, the image only showed an empty space. The cell seemed harmless, as it always had been, with its locked door and peeling walls. I grabbed the radio with still trembling hands and called a colleague. I asked, trying to sound casual, if he had noticed anything strange in that cell. After a few seconds of silence, he responded with a hesitant voice, almost uncomfortable. "Cell 13? No, man. That cell's been sealed for years. It was locked after an incident. They say something bad happened there." My body froze. The cell was sealed? Then what was it that I had seen? And more disturbing still, why did I feel as if it was still with me? Since that night, my life has never been the same. I haven't seen the creature again, but the feeling of being watched doesn't leave me, like a shadow that follows me wherever I go. At work, with every step I take through the prison's corridors, it's as if that oppressive silence envelops me again, bringing back the weight of that breath I heard in the cell. At home, the terror persists. During the nights, I wake up with the feeling that there's something in the room, something standing in the shadows, waiting. Even in my dreams it appears, not clearly, but as a presence lurking, suffocating, and uncomfortable. It's as if the creature has left a mark on me, something I can't erase. No matter what I do, that feeling of it being near never completely disappears. Each time I return to the prison, the fear grows like an unbearable weight on my chest. The worst of it all is that sometimes I hear that sound again, the slow, heavy breath echoing somewhere in the empty corridors. I try to tell myself it's just the wind or the old ventilation system, but I know it's not. It's her. She's there, waiting. I don't know what she wants or when she'll appear again, but deep down I feel it's only a matter of time. The greatest doubt that haunts me is not whether it will return, but whether when it does, I'll be able to face it, or if fear will make me run once more. And if I run, will I be able to escape her this time? I never imagined my life would end up like this, confined between the imposing bars and the cold walls of this penitentiary. When I was sent here, I already knew I would face extreme situations, dealing with criminals who, for the most part, had become accustomed to violence and pain. However, what truly began to torment me was not related to human beings at all, but something far more insidious. My second night was when it all began. The usual silence, which spreads throughout the entire pavilion at the end of the day, was interrupted by something I couldn't immediately identify. It came from the cell next door, and it wasn't the usual sounds of a restless prisoner or someone whispering. They were almost imperceptible murmurs, a contained cry or even a dragged-out prayer. Cell 17, which had been empty since my arrival, seemed to be the epicenter of this strange manifestation. The corridor light flickered constantly, as if trying to draw my attention to what was about to happen, and suddenly the sound ceased. But the silence that followed was even more disturbing. The next day I couldn't help but ask the other inmates about what was happening in the cell next door, especially 17. To my surprise, no one seemed willing to talk about it. Some looked away, others just gave nervous chuckles, as if it were a joke. But there was an old prisoner with a serious expression and a look filled with fear, who approached me after breakfast. He whispered almost imperceptibly, as if fearing to be overheard, "No one stays in 17. Whoever goes in there either goes insane or simply disappears." Initially, I laughed it off, thinking it was just a story made up to scare the newcomers, one of those urban legends that spread like wildfire among the inmates. However, little did I know that that very night, the nightmare would not be limited to the realm of imagination. That night, the sound came back to haunt me. It was no longer just a whisper. Now, muffled knocks echoed through the cold wall of my cell. The sound of nails scraping the concrete dragged agonizingly, as if something were trying to scratch its way out of somewhere. The most terrifying part, however, was the strange sensation that overtook my body. My metal bed, already uncomfortable in itself, began to tremble slightly, as if an invisible force were dragging itself from the other side of the wall. I didn't know if it was my mind, overcome by fear, or if something was really there, on the other side. I couldn't sleep the entire night. What was happening in 17? I didn't know, but I knew there was something in that place, something that shouldn't be ignored. A few days later, my cellmate, an older man with a tired look in his eyes, decided to tell me what he knew about Cell 17. He seemed hesitant at first, as if the mere mention of that number was enough to revive the nightmares he tried to bury. According to him, years earlier, an inmate was brutally tortured by other prisoners inside that cell. The body was found days later, already in an advanced state of decomposition. But the most disturbing thing was that no one could understand how the man had survived for so long, without food, water, or any kind of care. But the story didn't end there. From that moment on, anyone assigned to Cell 17 began reporting strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, an unbearable pressure on the chest that made it hard to breathe, and on some occasions, invisible hands pulling the blankets during the night. The most unsettling account, however, was from an inmate who, after spending a night in 17, was found in an extreme state of panic, huddled in the corner of his cell, with deep scratches all over his body, as if he had fought against something invisible. He was never the same again. The following nights became more and more unbearable. I tried at all costs to ignore the stories, convincing myself that they were just made-up tales to scare the newcomers, but I couldn't. It was impossible to ignore what was happening there. One night, something I could never have predicted happened. The corridor light flickered intermittently, as if it was about to go out completely. It was at that moment that I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, appeared at the entrance of the adjacent cell, motionless, but with unsettling movements, as if it had no bones. I was completely frozen. That thing didn't look human. When it moved, approaching the bars of my cell, its figure took on an even more grotesque shape. And then, it turned into what I could only call a face. It wasn't a human face, but there were two bright white spots where the eyes should have been. A pair of empty, hypnotizing eyes that seemed to stare directly at me. I couldn't look away. A coldness ran down my spine, and my heart raced. When I finally managed to scream, the other inmates began to stir, waking up from their sleep. However, the shadow disappeared instantly, as if it had never existed. I knew no one would believe me. They would say it was just a nightmare, a hallucination of someone scared by the environment. But I knew what I had seen. That place was far from normal. After that episode, things started to get even worse. I could no longer tell day from night, as the feeling of being constantly watched intensified. The prison, with its imposing walls and heavy air, seemed to have become an even more suffocating place, especially around Cell 17. The air was colder, as if something was draining the energy from the environment, making even the simplest movement feel exhausting. The other prisoners, who had previously ignored my fears, started to look at me strangely, as if I were a fool for being worried about something so trivial. But I knew that something wasn't right there. I was then warned by an old prisoner who told me that the only way to escape it was to pray and never, ever, look at whatever was inside the cell. It was an unwritten rule. Any attempt to challenge the presence in that cell was a fatal mistake. That last night, my curiosity, mixed with fear, led me to make the biggest mistake of my life. The whispers returned, louder and more incessant than ever. Unable to control the tension building up inside me any longer, I banged on the bars of my cell, desperately screaming that I wanted peace, that I needed silence. For a moment, everything went quiet, and I thought I had finally found some kind of relief. But then, the feeling of something cold and sticky began to envelop my body. I felt invisible hands pulling me back, as if they were trying to drag me to the back of the cell, to something I couldn't see. And then, a cold whisper, full of contempt, echoed directly in my ear. "You shouldn't have called." I tried to break free, but it was as if my body was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. Now I am writing this with trembling hands, trying to organize my thoughts as a sense of despair takes over me. Earlier today, the guards found my cellmate. He had wide-open eyes, staring at something no one else could see, and his body was covered in deep marks, as if he had been attacked by something invisible. He was completely out of his mind, in a state of absolute panic. And now I am alone here. The worst part is that the whispers haven't stopped. On the contrary, they have intensified. Now they are coming from within my own cell, whispering things I cannot understand. If anyone finds this, know this. Never ever provoke what resides in cell 17. The curse is real, and once it takes hold of you, there is no escape.